Hey everyone, welcome again to another Career Clarity and Confidence Live. I'm Kelli Thompson. I'm a women's leadership coach. If you're here, say hello, give me a heart or a like or a thumbs up so that I know you're here. Today, we're going to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, and that is women's leadership development. And I want to just give a little bit of backstory on this and why this is so near and dear. First, like not only is this something that my clients have been talking about a lot lately, I have a lot of clients right now who it's really exciting times for them. They've just gotten promoted either at their existing organization, which is really exciting. They've been promoted to directors, to VPs, or perhaps, a couple of them have joined brand new organizations. And in this brand new organization, the role that they have taken on is elevated. And so with this elevated role, I talk with a lot of them because with elevation comes exposure. And I think sometimes as leaders, we don't always think about that, about the impacts of exposure on our roles, because when you are higher up in leadership, um, there's just, I define exposure as just exposure and making riskier decisions, right? Because the decisions are higher stakes. And so when you have to make higher stakes decisions, it brings in sometimes a little bit more anxiety. And when you're making higher stakes and higher level decisions, there's more opportunity for people to voice their opinions on those ideas. And so there's just a lot of opportunity for critique. You're much more exposed in terms of title and your visibility and those sorts of things. And that can bring a lot of doubt and a lot of imposter syndrome. And so if you're watching with me today, just give me a heart or a like if this is something you've ever experienced, or tell me in the comments if this is something you've ever experienced, because I think sometimes we overlook, and I did this too personally as someone who used to manage training and development for organizations. I think sometimes we just assume that we're going to promote these folks, and as soon as they get promoted, that they'll kind of figure out how to be a leader. They'll adjust all the things that need to be adjusted in terms of like mindset and confidence and all these sort of things. And I think sometimes we assume that that part's just going to happen. And I know that I made that mistake when I was leading training and development teams in corporate America. So way back in the day before I ran my own leadership and coaching practice, I led leadership development and training in organizations, and we would develop standard onboarding for employees. And so onboarding could look things like, the skills that they need to know, how to understand our systems, how to understand our culture. We did talk about some basic performance management things, like here are the performance management steps that, we expect in the process. Here's how you give good feedback. Here's how you have a coaching conversation. But what I can honestly tell you is all those things were great. They were great and it was needed, but we never actually addressed so much of the mindset stuff that comes with leveling up your leadership, especially for women who haven't seen themselves typically in the rooms where decisions are made. And so what I'm seeing now from my clients, what I felt as a woman leader, but I just didn't have like the words then, like nobody talked about imposter syndrome. Nobody talked about like sometimes the self-doubt that you feel. Nobody talks about, what it's like to have to kind of have a higher tolerance for anxiety in terms of uncertainty and making decisions. And please tell me in the comments, like if your organization does this well, I want to hear about it. Like, let me know it does it well. Or, maybe if your organization doesn't do these things, like, I would be curious to know that too. I'd be curious to know who's doing it and who's not doing it, because I honestly believe that one of the things that's missing from women's leadership development is talking about all the things that I feel like are so hard to talk about: doubt, imposter syndrome, mindset, speaking up, using your voice, trusting yourself. Because here's the thing, and I love to use this example from my father-in-law. My father-in-law, in his time, worked at an organization where he oversaw like a local site of a branch of, I don't know exactly what he did. I feel like I'm having a Chandler Bing moment from Friends. I don't really exactly know what Chandler Bing's job is, what my father-in-law's job was, but I know he had direct reports and he managed a local branch of like a local government financial thing. Anyways, he was trying to understand what I do for a living. And so I told him that I'm a women's leadership coach. And he's like, coach? He's like, well, I go, yeah, I coach on leadership skills, developing confidence, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes, Well, I never had any of that formal training. And I said, well, how did you learn how to be a leader? And he goes, at the bar after work. And that is such a perfect analogy of why I think we overlook some of the needs that women have when they move into leadership is because men already are in the room. Men are already sitting in meetings with other men. The workplace was designed by men for men. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's literally just how the world worked back then. But I think sometimes like we overestimate like how much of or we underestimate actually how much they get from being in the room with other men, going to the bar after work, having those side conversations. How do I deal with this? How do I approach this, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what men naturally learn through the golf course, the bar after work, by sitting in the room with other men, women just haven't had that sort of seat at the table. And so, it's created a leadership development gap, whether it's been very, I don't think any of this has been intentional. Some of it is very unconscious and unintentional. But here's some interesting statistics that kind of support, I think, some of the feelings some of my clients have felt at work that I know I felt at work. Like I just felt all this doubt and insecurity, and I didn't feel like there was a place that I could go talk to someone about it, right? I didn't have my, oh, hey, I just kind of had this thing with my boss at the bar after work to kind of work through some of these things, that, my father-in-law joked about. And so this is super fascinating. So a DDI report found that they talked to 15,000 leaders in and more than 2,000 human resources directors. And what they found was that men are 13% more likely to get leadership skill training than women. They also found that men are 22% more likely to be paired up with a formal mentor. And I think this is where the gap lies. Because I think there's so many women who are moving into levels of leadership where they haven't seen themselves, especially, if it's not just women, it's people of color. I think women of color especially have not seen themselves. And so it just brings with it a lot of doubt, a lot of new exposure, a lot of uncertainty. And it's also kind of this weird paradox of like, I feel this way, but it's also really not okay for me to talk about these things at work. And it wasn't until I left corporate America and I started my own business and I started joining what we call women's mastermind groups in the entrepreneurship world. And these are groups where we come together and we talk about how to run a successful business. And it's all women. And in these groups, like not only do we talk about like business skills that we need, which are really important, but we talked about all of the other stuff. We talked about doubt and imposter syndrome and what it's like to be the only woman in the room and how to speak up and, all just kind of like the confidence issues that we deal with, the workload, the burnout, the unpaid workload. And it was so freeing to talk about these things. It was so freeing to talk about my kids and the challenges of being a working mom. And it was just open and non-judgmental. And it was in that moment where I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I needed in corporate America. And I still believe today that it's what we need in corporate America to close the leadership development gap. So I want to talk about two things that women can do to close the leadership development gap so that we can continue to have more women represented in the top ranks, and so that there's not kind of a glass cliff that they fall off of, or so that it can really improve turnover rates for women who are newly promoted, but also build their confidence, their results, their effectiveness. And then I want to talk about two things that employers can do. So for women, I just want you to be aware that there are opportunities for you to ask for support. Okay. So whether it's asking your employer, hey, what formal onboarding or mentoring programs do you have in this organization that I can take advantage of to support my transition as a leader, and asking for that, asking to be included, and maybe they don't have anything. Maybe they've never even thought of anything before, but perhaps it starts the conversation about creating like a formal partnership or mentoring. The second thing that you can ask your organization is maybe they don't have anything structurally, and that's okay, because a lot of organizations don't. A lot of organizations, including the ones that I worked for, had good standard onboarding when it came to, hey, here's how to give feedback. Here's our basic performance management. Here's our strategy. Here's our culture. But they didn't have deeper programs that address the very real challenges that women face in the workplace today. And so what a lot of organizations do is they outsource it. They say, you know what, we don't have this and we know it. We don't have the internal capabilities to build it, but we give every employee a stipend to go source something out on their own. So for women, two things that they can do to close the leadership development gap: ask what, standard support is available and ask for it to be created if it's not. Or two, if they don't have the capabilities to create it, ask for a leadership development stipend so you can go off and find the help that you need so that you can, show up as your most clear and confident self in these new levels of leadership. Because again, with new levels of leadership come new levels of exposure, new levels of conversations. It can not expose some of the challenges that you have, but again, when you are leading at that higher level, just more is going to be asked of you. And so a lot of women find that it's, at least my clients start asking questions like, "Oh, how do I work-life balance this? How do I manage my anxiety with big decisions? How can I feel confident speaking up in the rooms where decisions are made, especially if I'm the only woman?" And so it's finding programs like that address it. So two things that employers can do, and I want to highlight an organization that I worked with for a long time who did this very well, was I think it's really important to have standard onboarding tracks, and not just for new employees, but to have standard onboarding tracks for promoted employees. Again, sometimes I think we just think that we're going to promote this employee and magic will happen and they'll figure out how to be a leader overnight. They'll overcome any mindset issues that they have. They'll immediately shift their identity from doer to leader, and it just doesn't happen. And so I think it's really important to have some sort of standard onboarding track that really addresses some of those issues. And I think it's important to address some of the nuances that women and people of color may experience, because they typically haven't seen themselves in the room. And so I think sometimes the support can look a little bit different there than it traditionally has in the past. And if an organization doesn't have that mechanism or doesn't have the internal mechanism to build it, I think it's great to reach out and ask for help, to set aside budget dollars to bring in coaches or send their folks off to training. An organization who did this very well, I worked with for a time, is a company called Business Solver. They are a healthcare, they're a benefits enrollment technology company. And when they would hire on new leaders, they would hire me to coach that new leader, especially in their first 90 to 120 days, because they knew that onboarding period was so tender for them, and they wanted these new leaders to be successful. And when you are coming into a brand new, fast-growing organization, there's culture shock, there's learning opportunities. A lot of these folks are now leading at a new level. They've been promoted by being hired onto this company. And so with that, there's just a lot of mindset stuff. Sometimes folks have been experts at where they've come and now they're a beginner again, which in and of itself is a mindset shift. And so they really saw like hiring a coach for these newly hired leaders as a way to support them to not only improve their ramp up time, but to help reduce turnover too. They wanted to invest in these folks that they have worked so hard to hire. And I think that is an excellent way of providing support to newly hired leaders. And I know other organizations who do that as well. So again, to recap, the two things that companies can do is one, provide a standard onboarding track for all leaders, not just new leaders into the organization, but those who've been promoted. But then for, if they don't have those internal resources, to set aside budget to bring in either external coaches or training to help facilitate that transition. Because at the end of the day, this is important. For us as women to ask for the development and the support that we need, first, I think we need to recognize that there is a gap. But two, that asking for the support and the development that we need, whether it's being paired up with a mentor at work or asking for, a stipend so that we can go and get the support we need, whether it's sourced externally, has real benefits to our potential in helping us show up with more clarity, more confidence, overcoming all that mindset junk that often happens when you get promoted, a lot of that imposter syndrome, but it ultimately impacts us in our paycheck too. Because when women get the support that they need to make those successful transitions, they're more likely to be successful in those higher level roles, and they're less likely to turn over. They're more likely to manage their work-life balance well, which I know is something that's really important during the pandemic. So I'd be curious whether you're watching this live or you're watching it on replay, drop me a like or a heart if you feel like your organization does this well. I would also love to hear from you if you've seen examples of organizations who manage this leadership transition really well, and share your best tips. Drop your best tips in the comments or what you've seen done well, because I think this is a really great way that we can start to crowdsource some ways some organizations can support their women leaders, not only so they can be more confident and more effective, but also to reduce turnover as well, because we know that turnover comes with a pretty high cost. I know industry averages say it's like 1.5 to 2 times someone's annual salary. So if this is something that your organization needs help with and you want to reach out to me, send me a DM. You can always email me at kelly@kellyraythompson.com. I do have women's leadership training programs that organizations bring in-house to specifically support their women leaders. And we can also talk about what coaching options I have available to support some of your newly promoted women leaders into their leadership role. So my website is kellyraythompson.com. And I'd love to hear from you, whether it's dropping your tips below or reaching out to me behind the scenes to talk about what I can do or what I've seen other organizations do well. So here's to closing the leadership development gap at work. We can't always rely on learning how to be a leader in the bar anymore, like my father-in-law did. So I think it's really important to be conscious and intentional about providing, and Linda, you make a great comment about raising and being intentional about a real need for women in the workplace today. So thanks for being on with me live, and I will see you all next Tuesday.